Hi, my name is David Lee, and today we're going to talk about GitHub Action workflow. So as developers, we all know that GitHub is a place where we can host our code. And as such, it's also a natural place for us to start to begin to build, test, and release our code from. And this is where we can think about using GitHub Action for. To be clear, GitHub Action can also be used for both CI/CD process, but in our presentation, we'll be really focused on GitHub Action around CI or continuous integration. So let's talk about GitHub Action workflow, right? We hear a lot of around, people talking about GitHub Action or GitHub Action workflow. And we can think of GitHub Action workflow as related to Azure DevOps pipeline. So there's a kind of that synonym, which represent that same concept. But with GitHub Action, it really relates to specific steps that we can execute, and we'll kind of see a little bit of that in a hands-on presentation in a little bit. So, but let's talk about what is inside of a GitHub Action workflow. The first thing that we should note is, for building your application, testing your application, right? There's this concept of runner, where we can select the type of operating system, right? So the agent itself that is doing your builds or your tests or any other things, right, is running on a particular operating system. So we have Windows, Linux, or Mac OS as our runner. Now, when we start to write our GitHub Action workflow, right, it's actually in the format of YAML. And so, there's kind of, if you're familiar with Kubernetes, right, that's the kind of format. And we'll actually go through writing that in a moment. The other thing that we should kind of take note of on a high level is events. And it is, it will be written in a way such as using that on keyword, which is really, you can think of that as a trigger, right? For example, if you try to commit some code or you try to do a pull request, right? Those are some examples of events that can trigger your GitHub Action workflow. Obviously, in some cases, we might want to ignore triggering a GitHub Action workflow. So, for example, you might want to ignore changes when you're editing your Readme file, right? So, in cases where you're just modifying your Readme file, you want to ignore that file. So there's also that ignore syntax that we can use. So from a organization level, there's jobs, steps, and then obviously your GitHub Actions, right? So we can think of jobs as kind of that unit of work isolation. So for example, you might have a need to deploy code in parallel, and you could have a different job that is doing your database deployment, right? So you might have 5 different databases, and so you would have 5 different jobs to run scripts in parallel to update those databases, for example, right? So jobs can be kind of your unit of work, your isolation. And then within each job, you can have your steps, which really consists of that action. So you might have an action to, get some scripts or DAC pack, for example, right? Download that. And then you can have another step that executes that file, right, in order to deploy your database. So that's really just kind of coming from a high-level overview of GitHub Action workflow. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide, where we want to do some hands-on coding for writing our GitHub Action workflow. So before we begin, we're going to actually create a .NET Web API project and actually write some unit tests, right? So the focus of today's presentation is around continuous integration. And as part of continuous integration, there will be some unit tests that we want to execute. And so the scenario is, as developers, whenever we commit code, we really want to have that quick, fast feedback loop on whether our code broke anything, right? And so the practice is to write some unit tests in order to make sure that we didn't break any other people's code, and that we have our own unit tests, so that if people are changing some areas of code that is related to ours, it will be tested. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to run the unit tests locally to make sure that they work, and then we're going to start writing the GitHub Action workflow, the YAML file. And once we do that, then we'll be able to push all of that into a GitHub repo. And then we'll be able to look at the actions and see our workflow being executed, and also view the published test results, right? So the expectation is whatever test we're running locally, it's going to be running as part of GitHub Action workflow, and we will be able to view the test results. So we'll jump into the next part where we create the .NET Web API project. Right, we're ready to create a brand new project. So we're going to choose API. We're going to create an ASP.NET Core Web API. We're going to name the project My Web API. And I'm going to click unselect that guy. So we click next. And we'll just leave the default settings. And we're going to pull this project over here. So the first thing we're going to do is, when we create a default web API project, we have this weather forecast API that is being created. So that's what I'm going to be making use of. And I'm going to be making some modifications to the weather forecast API so that we can include unit testing as part of what we're trying to do here, right? So I went ahead and rework the weather forecast API so that it will only have date and temp, a temperature. And then I am going to go to the weather forecast API. And then we can notice that there's a get function. So we're not going to make any changes here yet. What we're going to do is we're going to create a service for kind of our database layer, if you will. But it's really going to be the in-memory version of our database. So I'm just going to create a static list here for weather forecast, and IntelliSense is filling out a lot of the code that I need. So the first method that I'm going to create is, weather forecast. Okay. So we're going to do a add here. Okay. And then we're also going to do a get weather forecast by date. And there may not be any weather forecasts. So we're gonna do a question mark here to indicate that there's a potential to return null. And so we're gonna do a weather forecast dot single or default, and the date will be equals to the date time here. All right, a very simple class. So we have the ability to add weather forecast, and we have the ability to get weather forecast. So we're going to make some modifications in our weather forecast controller. We actually don't need this anymore. And we will create a static instance of the weather forecast service. Yep. Okay, so we have that. And so the first operation that we're going to do, I'm just going to copy this guy here. And we'll do a put. And we'll say add weather forecast. And this is going to return I actually result to indicate some sort of HTTP status back. But we do expect the body to contain weather forecasts. And so we're going to use the service and add it. Okay. So for getting the weather forecast, we're going to require date time. So date is the variable. And then we will return weather forecast back. So let's just do one assertion here is if result is null, return not found, which is going to be a 404. And this reminds me that we need to update the response. Otherwise, we'll return a 200, which is okay with the results. Okay. So let me just make sure. Yep. So we actually won't want to return an okay here too. Okay. So let's go ahead and because of our controller class is static. This doesn't have to be a static here. And again, right, this is just acting as a database. In real life, you probably are connected to a real database. But in our case, we're just going to do it in memory, and the weather forecast service is a static instance. Okay, so we will go ahead and run our project, make sure it builds. Okay, and we will need to pull we'll need to pull the browser window over here. Okay, so notice that we have this nice looking Swagger. So what we can do now is we can, start to execute that, and we got a 200 back. Let's do another one for the 11th for temperature of 10. Okay, and again, it came back as a success. So let's go and do a get with the date of 2020, May 13th. And return a 404 back. So what we need to do is try to figure out what is going on. So let's do this instead. Let's take the date of 2022. Yeah, I think because I didn't do 2022, There we go. So it came back as 0. And if we do the 11th, we get 10 back. But if we do like the 1st, maybe we should get a 4 back, and voila. So this is good, and let's continue with our code. So I'm gonna close this guy. So we're gonna start writing some unit tests. And before I do that, I'm just gonna go ahead and give some examples of the unit tests that I'm gonna write. So, you know, one thing that I wanna assert is if the date of the weather forecast has already been added, then I don't want it to be, I don't want that to be allowed. So I'm gonna throw a application exception. You know, we're just gonna say duplicate, but in real life, we probably will put something more meaningful. And if, for example, you know, maybe we don't expect the temp, the temp to go above, let's say, you know, 150, for example, or maybe do 200, right? If it's over 200, then we can say, you know, out of range. And if the weather forecast of temp is less than minus 200, we're gonna do the same thing and throw a new, and just say out of range. Okay. So this is our business logic, right? And this should be unit testable. So what we're gonna do here is we are going to create a new project. We're gonna look for tests and just call it my web API tests. Click next. Create that, have a reference to my web API. One thing that I like to do typically is I like to make sure all my NuGet packages are up to date. And I'm gonna do that right now. Okay, very good. And I am going to rename my unit test class. And so I'm going to create this as add duplicate result in exception. So what we need to do for testing our class is we can create a read-only weather forecast service. Okay, let's do the appropriate using. Okay, we're going to new it up. And now we can add weather forecast. So let's do the date as today, for example. And temp is 10. Then we're going to do assertion that, or assert throw exception, application exception, and we're going to say, you know, let's say now that we've added it again, So it should throw an exception because we don't allow duplicate dates. So if I do run all tests, okay, so that worked. It did throw an exception, which is why this unit test is green. We're going to do a few more. In fact, just to save some time, I am going to copy and paste from some code that I had written previously here. And just kind of rename them. Okay. So just to save some time, I wrote another task where if I'm adding a high temperature of greater than 200, then it should throw an exception. If I, add a temperature of less than 200, it's going to give another exception. If I add the right temperature, it's not going to give an exception. If I add a temperature for 2 different dates, no exceptions, right? So let's go ahead and make sure that works. Okay, so all my tasks pass, and that means I am good to go. Let's just go ahead and just run it one time in Swagger. So we're gonna go ahead and add this date, and it went fine. If we try to add the date with a different temperature, we get a 500 back. So that means we want to do one more thing with our code because this isn't optimal. What we want to do is catch the application exception and return it as a bat request to be so the client side understands what's going on, right? So let's go ahead and run it again. So try it out. Let's just do 10 here. Okay, so get 200 back. Try it again. It should have an app exception. And yep, we got a 400 bat request with the error message called duplicate. So we're good there. And if we try to do a get with the date that is here, cool, we get a success back. But if we do a date that is not in the system ever, and say execute, yep, we get a, yeah, this is actually not changing the date, so let me just do the date, the 10th. Did we have the 10th? Let's try the 11th. Yeah, I'm gonna 404 back because the 11th hasn't been created yet. Okay, very good. So this is mimicking our local testing scenario, and we also did a quick test through Swagger to make sure that our API is working as desired. And so the next step is we're going to create a GitHub Action workflow, and we're going to create a YAML. So the next thing is I'm going to launch Visual Studio Code and we will go ahead and create our GitHub Action workflow. All right, so I have launched my Visual Studio Code, and now I'm ready to start writing my GitHub Action workflow. The first thing that I'm going to do is create a YAML file, but it actually has to be in a specific folder. So what I can do here is I'm going to create the file underneath .github in a folder called workflows, and then I can name it whatever I want, and I'm just going to name it f.yaml. Now, I actually forgot to say this, but there is a extension that will be useful. It's made by Red Hat called, and it's the YAML extension. If we do install that, then what will happen is, we will have IntelliSense. And so if you recall from our presentation earlier, I talked about the ability to do trigger or events, right? So when should our workflow YAML file or our workflow execute, right? So it's using this on keyword, and we should do it on push. Oops. Let's see, push. There we go. And so the other thing that would be useful for us is, we want, let's say we're going to have a Readme file here, right? And we can just, it's a Readme file is really useful for our GitHub project, right? So if we have documentation related to our project, we should really have this kind of Readme file that allows other developers to be able to read your documentation. So my point is we should have some way to ignore the Readme file. So there's a paths ignore, and we can say that we want to ignore readme.md. Yeah, so there's additional things that we need to do. That's why there's a little red squirrely bracket there. In addition, what I really want to do is also ignore the main branch, right? So for continuous integration, we should have, we may have other branches. In my case, I'm planning to create a main branch, right, which is what I'm on right now, but also staging and depth, right? But everything should be integrated into staging branch, which means my main branch is focused on just a copy of production. And so I don't want my workflow to execute whenever there is a push into the main branch. So this is what I did is, don't do anything if this is the main branch. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is, add job, and I'm going to name my job build tasks, and give it a name. Let's just call it, let me think, built-in run tasks. And so we also talked about the runner. So here I'm going to say run on Windows, latest version of Windows. And then I will have steps. Okay, so we did talk about steps previously. So I'm going to, first of all, do a checkout. So I'm going to copy and paste that from a different project that I have here. And so we're going to do this action for doing a checkout, to check out the code. And the next step, which I'm actually going to give the next step a name, is to set up .NET 6. So every runner has certain things installed. There may or may not be a .NET framework installed already. So this guarantees, I'm going to again copy that action to set up .NET 6, right? So what I'm going to do here is using the with, I'm going to say .NET version is going to be .NET 6. There we go. Okay, so the next one is going to be doing a unit test. So in this example, I'm also going to give you another syntax called ID, right? So if you need to reference outputs from different steps, you can actually have this ID that allows you to do that kind of reference, right? So I'm going to name it unit test. And I'm going to say the working directory is going to be under my web API tests, because my unit test is underneath this project. So that's why this working directory is called my web API tests. And now I can do a run. So I can write my command here, but I can also do kind of a new line type of syntax where I have multiple lines of commands to run. So let me see. So I'm going to go ahead and actually copy that command to do the .NET unit testing. Okay, so as you can see here, I'm doing a .NET test, and I'm actually having the JUnit logging output for my unit test, right? So when you do a .NET test, and I'm going to do one here, .NET test. Okay, and you can see that it's just outputting it as this kind of format, but on GitHub, we actually want it to be outputted to a specific format so that we can use that to create an artifact out of that, right? And be able to show our UI in a more meaningful way, which means I need to go back to my project here. And in order for me to generate that kind of output, there is a library that I need to, or there's a NuGet package that I need to install called JUnit test logger. And I'm just going to install it in my solution, which seems to, yep, so it did install and everything should build fine. I'm just going to try to rebuild. Very good. So continuing on, I should be able to output my test in JUnit, and I should be able to continue. So the last step here is that I will publish test result. Okay, and I'm gonna say that it uses. So again, I'm gonna copy another library. This particular library is used to help me with the publish process, and Then I can say with files, and I can just copy from here. All right. So let's kind of look at this command again. So when I do the .NET tasks, I did tell it where to output my unit test XML, which is in that JUnit kind of format. And then in this last step, then I'm going to take that file and I'm going to use that, right, and publish it so that it can be outputted using this particular GitHub action. All right, so the next step is we are going to push this and commit this into our Git repo in a moment. All right, so now to the most exciting part of the whole work that we've done so far, right? So I've created a GitHub repository, and also I have cloned the repository locally. So now I am in the main branch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new branch, right? Because we've told the GitHub action that hey, you should not watch out for main branch. So nothing's going to happen, right? When I try to put anything in the main branch. So here in this case, I'm going to create a dev branch, and what I'm going to do is maybe make some changes, and then check out if the code is being pushed. So I'm not going to make any real changes. So all I'm going to do is just add some comments to try to kick things off. So I'm going to do an add here to make sure that everything is added. Testing, okay. And I'm going to do a git push, which fails because I need to have additional command to indicate that I want to push it to my GitHub repo, which I'm going to do. All right, so this should kick off some GitHub action. And I'm going to come here, and you can see just testing just kicked off. And we can see that the build and run test is running. And so once this process is started, then we should be able to see all the other steps show up on the left, right? Because GitHub needs to parse the file and look at all the different steps. We'll give it a few moments, and we'll be right back. All right, so we can actually see that it started to execute all the different steps. We've told it to set up the .NET 6. We've told it to run the unit tests, and that's what this is doing right now. And that should take several moments. So we'll come back again, but I just wanted to step in kind of in the middle just to show us what does it look like when it's doing when it's running the unit test, for example, here. Okay, so the workflow did complete, and we can see that there's actually this unit test result being published, which is the result of this particular step called the publish test result steps. So if we look here, we can actually see that it gives us kind of a more pretty looking UI for telling us which of the tests pass. But if certain tests aren't passing, then it's probably going to give us some of the errors here. One thing that I like to take note of is when you try to create a brand new GitHub repo, and because of this particular requirement, you should probably go to settings, go to action, go to general, and in your workflow permission, you need to set the read and write permissions. And this will allow that file to be created and written, right? Otherwise, you're going to get a 403 forbidden error, strange looking one. So I hope this demonstration or presentation helped you create your GitHub Action workflow for continuous integration purposes. And we'll have another presentation around continuous deployment. All right, very good. Thank you so much.